So welcome to our last Tertulia of the year. I want to begin by acknowledging that we are on the stolen territories of the Wolastoqiyik, whose ancestors, along with the Mi'kmaq and Passamaquoddy nations, signed peace and friendship treaties with the British Crown starting in 1725 and into the 1700s. As we gather tonight, we follow the news of the 6 Wolastoqiyik nations who have filed a title claim against forestry companies, including J.D. Irving, as well as MB Power, in light of reckless exploitation of the lands which have violated the peace and friendship treaties. So I encourage you to follow the title claim, the lawsuit on the Wolastoqiyik Nation in New Brunswick website at wolastoqiyik.ca, as well as the MB Media Co-op will be covering the story as well. So on behalf of the Tertulia organizers, myself, Tracy Glenn, as well as Christy Lane and Matthew Hayes at St. Thomas University and Daniel Tubb at the University of New Brunswick, we are excited to have Sabine LeBel with us tonight to share her thoughts on superheroes as part of our pop culture edition. Tertulia's Fredericton is supported by the MB Media Co-op, publisher of the video recordings of the Tertulia talks, as well as Milda's, who has generously offered our audience a discount on pizzas ordered on Tertulia night. So I hope you got to enjoy a slice of pizza or two tonight and support Milda's on other nights. So Tertulia's is taking a bit of a break this winter, but we may add a special Tertulia or two. So stay tuned on our Facebook event page, Tertulia's Fredericton, or you can sign up to receive community calendar updates at info@mbmediacoop.org. And you'll get notices of cool events like this one there. So our speaker tonight is Sabine LeBel. Sabine is an assistant professor in the Culture and Media Studies Department at the University of New Brunswick, Fredericton, working in the area of environmental media studies. Her research is in the areas of waste, effect, and the visual. Her research has been published in Globalizations, NANO, North American Notes Online, and Canadian Women's Studies, like Cahiers de la Femme, among others. She also has an art practice, mostly consisting of video work, with pieces screening internationally at Inside Out Festival in Toronto, Out on Screen in Vancouver, and Cineffable in Paris, among others. So in 2016, with Casey Burkholder, who I think is with us tonight, Sabine started the Fredericton Feminist Film Collective, dedicated to making, screening, and talking about works by and for queers, trans folks, and women. So Sabine, now I'll turn it over to you.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? Is the volume okay? I guess you guys can adjust it anyways yourselves. I'm going to start by sharing my screen. So as Tracy said, my name is Sabine LeBel, and my topic for this evening is superhero movies. And I'm not going to repeat the land acknowledgement that I have written on my slide, because the one that Tracy read is about a bajillion times better than the one that I have as my standard email land acknowledgement. And what I like to do when I'm doing a public talk is to think a little bit about how my work might fit in and relate to some of the relations that are laid out in the peace and friendship treaties. And what I see in this paper, like a lot of my academic work, is that UNB, the university I'm employed at, is built on the foundation of genocide and white supremacy that underlies the Canadian state. And as with all Canadian universities, directly contributes to the erasure of Indigenous knowledge, culture, and language. And I think sometimes it can be a really difficult connection to make. It's sort of like this abstract thing. And so when you're working in an area like mine, which is cultural studies, I think those connections can be challenging to make, especially when you're doing a talk like I am on something that can seem pretty frivolous or maybe silly, like superheroes. So one of the ways an easy way into thinking about this, I suppose, is to think about representation and the fact that there are really no Indigenous superhero movies. And I don't want any of the fanboys out there to at me, because I am aware of this list of the 25 best Native American superheroes ranked. But I think the point is, especially when we're talking about superhero films, that we really haven't seen the same kind of representation. We're not seeing Indigenous writers, actors, and all that kind of stuff in there. So as much as I'm not actually going to talk about this directly in the talk today, I'm going to think more through femininity and whiteness. It is sort of the larger frame that guides my research. And I also want to give a little shout out to Wendy Narby, who, when we went to go see the recent film Night Raiders, pointed out that it was probably the closest to an Indigenous superhero that either of us had ever really seen on screen. So this paper has two origin stories, and the first one relates to my past research on superhero films and the special effects body. And so one of the things I did as part of that project was I wrote this paper called Tone Down the Boobs, Please, Reading the Special Effect Body in Superhero Movies. And just a little comment about where that title comes from. It's actually something that Kirsten Dunst said when she saw, so she played Mary Jane in the early Spider-Man films. And they made a video game, a Spider-Man video game, kind of like coming out of the movie as part of that big superhero franchise. And when she saw the character that they had created for the video game of the Mary Jane character, the breasts were just like enormous and insane. And so apparently she said to the makers, she asked them if they could toe down the boobs, please. So I've always loved that little moment. So that's the first origin story of this talk. And the second origin story of this talk is relating to the fact that my therapist used the word empath in a therapy session. And I was really astonished to find out that the term has left the realms of science fiction, like Deanna Troi on Star Trek, and entered medical discourse. So the figure of the empath has a long and storied tradition in superhero comics, also in science fiction in general. So the Marvel database catalogs 230 instances of empaths existing or doing empath things in the Marvel universe. In this paper, I'm going to focus on tropes of white femininity and empathy. And in particular, I want to see how they play out through the character of Jean Grey in the X-Men movies. And I'm going to particularly focus on the film Dark Phoenix, which came out in 2019. So before going any further, I just want to make a couple of comments. One, this is definitely a work in progress. This is the first time I've been working through these ideas, so bear with me. Second, this is for sort of the nerds out there. It's a note on methods for people who care about these sorts of things. This is definitely one of those cultural studies moments where I'm really looking at the interplay of text. So I'm not just sticking to movies, but I'm looking at a lot of other texts that kind of, I think, really contribute to the superhero genre. And thirdly, there's so much to talk about in terms of superhero films, and it's like rich in all of the ways, good, bad, and everything in between. And I'm not going to be talking about so many of the things that are interesting, including, you know, recent superhero films that a lot of people wanted to talk about in terms of things that overlap maybe with my interests, like Wonder Woman, boo, Black Panther, yay, and also some of the other films like the X-Men that do some pretty interesting things and make some pretty interesting cultural commentary. So I'm not doing any of that stuff. I'm really just sticking to Jean Grey in Dark Phoenix. So I want to start by making a few comments about my earlier research on superhero films. And so when I was doing that project, I was really interested in the resurgence of superhero films around the year 2000. And I was particularly interested in investigating what I saw as a really, really regressive portrayal of male and female bodies and gender relations. And one of the sort of franchises that I had focused on at that time, and that I'm obviously focusing on again right now, is the X-Men franchise. And one of the things that the X-Men film franchise really does is constantly punish the female superheroes. The plot of the film is constantly punishing them, especially if they sort of seem to get too powerful. And so what I argued when I was doing my earlier research project is that doing a feminist analysis in terms of representation along the axes of race, class, gender, and even maybe sexuality has become really obvious and even banal to a certain extent because of the ways that racism and sexism, et cetera, are intentionally played on by dominant culture. So there was a sort of like frustration on my part that this was something that it doesn't create a satisfying analysis is what one of my frustrations was. So Scott Buchapman wrote a really important book on superheroes called Matters of Gravity. And he's like the guy in terms of superhero films. And his interest is really about how in superhero films, particularly the male superheroes, but all superheroes, the way they fly around. He's really interested in the kinetics of the superhero body and the way it takes up space, especially in the city. So he is the kind of person you would expect just to be like, I love superheroes. But in 2011, he wrote this article that I really like, and it's called Why I Hate Superhero Movies. And in that article, he argued, quote, superhero films seem to take the safest or most familiar version of their eponymous characters. The remarkable range of superhero comics finds no real analog in superhero films, which seem to be one of two things, light or dark, end quote. Similarly, in her article, Gender and Power, the Phoenix, Jean Grey Across Time and Media, Lenise Prater argues that X-Men movies and the X-Men franchise in general translates the most offensive representations from the original comics into the film version. She notes, quote, the changes made to the comic book narrative by the film amount to a series of suspicious coincidences, which foreground stories about women losing control of their powers while eliding stories about men losing control of their power. So basically, she's really frustrated by what she sees as a fairly rich kind of place to get stories from, which is like the comics, and that really doesn't translate into the film. So she's frustrated in a similar way that Scott Buchapman is, and I would say that I am as well. So what I would add to these frustrations is the incredibly rich intertextual landscape of the superhero genre that goes far beyond superhero films and indeed far beyond superhero comics and superhero graphic novels. And there's so many brilliant parodies, brilliant commentary on the superhero genre. And the slide I have up here right now, some of you undoubtedly will recognize it. It's from Saturday Night Live. They used to do this little animation called The Ambiguously Gay Duo. And it was, I thought, quite wonderful. There's also things like Michael Chabon's novel that was published in 2000 called The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay. More recently, in a spoof piece in McSweeney's, Karen Chee makes fun of the hetero race and gender dynamics of the superhero film genre. So she wrote this hilarious, I think it's hilarious, monologue that's titled, Hi, it's me, the girlfriend of a Marvel superhero, trying to return this used car. I'm just going to read you a little bit of it. It reads, hey, it's me, a white woman who is the love interest of a white superhero. You may know me from my very many accomplishments, but you probably don't because we never explore those and instead just list my achievements in passing to seem like I'm a strong, independent woman. And so the monologue kind of continues as this imaginary white girlfriend tries to return a used car that her superhero boyfriend, of course, is like smashed into bits. And it sort of really, in quite a hilarious way, spoofs the sort of emotions, femininity, and whiteness. And she really skewers the Marvel franchise and its regressive race and gender politics. And one of the reasons I wanted to kind of lead with this Karen Chee piece is because it really foregrounds some of the things I want to talk about in terms of the 2019 X-Men film, Dark Phoenix. So the film hasn't really been particularly well received. Many reviewers actively dislike the sort of psychological take or the psychological approach the film uses, especially when compared to other superhero films. So let me give you a little synopsis of the film for those who haven't seen it, and then I'm going to get into thinking through empaths a little bit more. So Dark Phoenix deals with the X-Men's Jean Grey, who is one of the most powerful empaths in the Marvel Universe. And it begins with the X-Men going into space to rescue a NASA shuttle. Jean Grey saves the day, and as part of her saving the day, this cosmic force enters her body. And for those who may be unfamiliar with X-Men and this particular storyline, this cosmic force is also called Phoenix, and the way the so I'm going to sort of refer to it as cosmic force and the phoenix, because it sort of varies a little bit between the various kind of X-Men storylines and films and all this kind of stuff in terms of how this particular force plays out. So the X-Men save the day, they come back to Earth, and Jean is different. The storyline is ostensibly about how Phoenix, or this cosmic force, has entered Jean's body, and ostensibly also about these aliens, they're called the Dabari aliens, who come down to Earth to try to get the force from her, to get it out of her body so that they can take over Earth. So it's like pretty predictable superhero stuff. But what I argue is that the storyline really follows Jean's emotional journey. As one reviewer notes, the film is less about magic stones than a woman trying to control the pain of her own trauma. So the prologue of the film really supports this analysis, and it shows Jean as a child when she accidentally causes a car accident with her powers and kills her parents in this car accident. So at that time in the narrative of the film, Professor Charles Xavier takes her in. So back in the present day of the film universe, this cosmic force is augmenting Jean Grey's already amazing powers, and Jean discovers that the Professor Xavier has lied to her. Her father's still alive, and that Professor put controls in her mind to hide this truth from her. So the film shows adult Jean coming to terms with this history of betrayal. So on some level, the story of Dark Phoenix is really about all these men that are sort of harming and betraying Jean Grey, and her emotional response to it, which of course, because she's an empath, really spills out into the world of the universe. So her birth dad, and then the professor, and then later in the film, Magneto or Eric, they all sort of like turn on her in various ways. So I want to turn now to thinking about empaths, because there's this really rich cultural history around sort of the figure of the empath and empathy as an affect or an emotion. So Susan Lanzoni traces the history of the term empathy in the English language, and she says that in 1908, two psychologists brought this word into the English language from German. So by the 1950s, the term takes the definition that we are now familiar with. It means to feel or to know another person's feelings. In the Marvel universe, an empath is a class of superpower. And the way that it's defined in the Marvel universe is the psionic ability to sense, control, alter, and manipulate the feelings, sensations, or emotions of other people psionically. Individuals with this ability are sometimes called empaths. So the X-Men as a comic book began in 1963. And so you can see that if we're looking at sort of like the history or the timeline around the term empath, the term empath or empathy is sort of well established in American English and vernacular by that point. And the X-Men comic book really had storylines that were inspired by the civil rights movement. And as a random of a detail as this might seem, it actually really matters when we're thinking about empathy and empaths. So Stan Lee deliberately crafted Professor Xavier to mirror Martin Luther King, and Magneto or Eric to mirror Malcolm X. So the creation of fictional white characters inspired by real life Black leaders deserves a longer comment than I'm going to make here. But for now, I just want to flag it as yet another example of appropriation, or what Bell Hooks calls eating the other, in her important and still incredibly relevant 1992 essay, Eating the Other, Desire and Resistance. But I also want to locate this weird inspiration moment of Stan Lee in the larger tradition of Black culture in the US. The sentimental tradition in the US is one of its kind of ways it plays out is within literature. And it's been taken up by many writers, especially Black writers, who deliberately use sympathy and empathy to gain support for the abolition of slavery, and then later on for civil rights movement. So an easy example that folks might know would be Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. So the tactic in this literature and in this kind of genre is to show the humanity of all people, especially Black and enslaved people. As Rebecca Wanzo, who's written extensively on this topic, says, quote, identification with pain is thus an organizing principle in such texts. Empathy and sympathy are treated as central to the concept of universal humanity, end quote. So Wanzo has a book project that's called The Suffering Will Not Be Televised, and it was published in 2009. And in that book, she looks at the ways in which the suffering of Black women in the United States is sidelined and how the sentimental tradition engages with different types of suffering. So that particular project that she does starts sort of like back in the time of slavery in the US and goes right up to a contemporary moment, of 2009 anyways, in the US. So she's looking at Oprah and all sorts of different cultural texts. So this history, I would argue, really matters for how the figure of the empath has shifted and has become a staple in mainstream self-help discourse, from TikTok to popular psychology pages. So there's this kind of contemporary moment with this figure of the empath, and with this kind of idea of empathy. So this resurgence of the term empath outside the realm of science fiction and superhero narratives, in mainstream and kind of like mainstream therapeutic discourses, it typically centers white women's experiences, although the term itself is not intended at all to have that meaning, but it's just sort of the way it seems to often get taken up. In these discursive spaces, there's a transition from the language of trauma to that of empathy. And again, I thank Erin Fredericks at STU for helping me think through that connection. So the term empath in these like therapeutic spaces refers to how people with trauma histories respond to other people and their feelings. And so basically the reasoning is that if you have childhood trauma, you develop this habit of being very attuned to the emotions of others around you, so you can navigate and avoid abuse and outbursts from adults around you. So empathy here is a trauma coping mechanism. And it sounds a lot to me like some of the discussions around hypervigilance, for example, in terms of trauma histories. So I'm really interested in how this current moment around empathy and resilience is being taken up. So of course, because the spoofs are just brilliant on this topic, I'm going to show you another spoof article. Again, it's another short imagined monologue. Hi, I'm an empath now. And I'm just going to read you a little bit of the spoof, because I think it really kind of nails both sort of like how this kind of term functions, but also offers a really succinct kind of critique of it. So part of the article reads, you may get confused as to why I have so much emotion all the time. So it's important for me to speak my truth. And quite frankly, I'm kind of upset that I'm the one who had to bring it up. It's very important that you understand that I am an empath. Being an empath means that I'm particularly sensitive to all those around me and feel their emotions very deeply. My identity as an empath has truly given me the freedom to be myself. Thank you for listening, even though it would have been totally shitty if you didn't. I look forward to you walking on eggshells around me until a new personality type is trending. So you can see that, again, this is like really poking fun at the ways that particular people have picked up this sort of something that almost kind of functions as like a diagnosis, and it's become this identity category. The other thing that I'm really interested in is the way that it's functioning in mainstream pop psychology and therapeutic spaces, especially on the internet and across various social media. So I've just got a couple of examples of headlines here that really can help nicely connect us back to my interests around superheroes. And the first headline here says, is being an empath a superpower or a super stressor? And then the other one I wanted to show you is this one, 8 ways to turn your empathy into a superpower. And I think it's really significant that the visual culture around these texts shows these free, smiling young white women. And I just want to make a comment about, sorry, I just like threw a bunch of texts at you, and I just want to sort of make a summarizing comment about some of the trends that I'm seeing there. So there's a crucial difference between empathy being something that is used as a political strategy on the level of community or nation to deal with colonialism and systemic racism. So again, this obviously is more in terms of some of the histories of sentimental literature, for example, versus empathy being an emotional response and identity category at the level of the individual that ends up empowering white women who are having a lot of feelings. And obviously I'm oversimplifying and glossing over a lot here, but these are sort of some of the trends that I'm seeing. So back to Jean Grey, there are so many details in Dark Phoenix that signal that the film is going to be an emotional journey rather than perhaps a more traditional superhero epic narrative. Not to say there's not battle scenes and all the sort of usual things you expect, but there's really a psychological kind of element to the storyline. And one of the first clues is that the actor, Sophie Turner, pictured here on the screen, who plays Jean Grey, studied mental illnesses, mostly schizophrenia, dissociative identity disorder, and multiple personality disorder for 9 months to prepare for this role. So just compare that to the sort of regimen that so many actors do when they're preparing to take an action role, where they're like bulking up and like eating protein shakes and working out and doing whatever it is that actors do to prepare for those kinds of roles. Another clue might be in the opening monologue of Dark Phoenix, which is in the voice of adult Jean Grey. And she says, "Who are we? Are we simply what others want us to be? Are we destined to a fate beyond our control? Or can we evolve, become something more?" So compare that opening monologue to the opening monologue of the first X-Men movie that, of course, is in Professor Xavier's voice. And he says, "Mutation is the key to our evolution. It has enabled us to evolve from a single-celled organism to the dominant species on the planet. The process is very slow, normally taking thousands and thousands of years. Every few millennia, evolution leaps forward." So compare those two speeches. Jean Grey's speech is really tentative. It's very personal. And while it's ostensibly about mutation mutants, because it's an X-Men film, it sounds a lot like somebody who's going on a journey of self-discovery or a healing journey of some kind. There's significant differences between the comic book and film stories around the Jean Grey Phoenix storyline. The translation from comic to film contains suspicious coincidences, to borrow Prater's phrase, in terms of the portrayal of women and their superpower. As the narrative progresses in Dark Phoenix, we learn that Professor Xavier has put controls in Jean's mind when she was a child without her permission, and many, many reviewers have commented on the deep misogyny of this action. It frames the professor as an abuser rather than a beloved teacher and mentor, which of course is how he is typically portrayed. So in a really important scene in the beginning of the film, Hank, Raven, and Professor Xavier, who you can see Hank and Raven are kind of like at the edge there. They're in Cerebro. And so for people who maybe don't know the X-Men stuff, Cerebro is this like big, giant machine room thing that Professor Xavier goes in and he puts this helmet thing on his head and it augments his powers. And so the still here is from a sequence in the film when these three are trying to like figure out what's going on. And so you can see like all that swirly pink stuff, of course, is Jean Grey's chaotic female mind. And they're sort of like all in there kind of like almost inside her mind with Professor Xavier. So during this sequence, Raven, or Mystique, and the professor have a conversation in which it becomes clear that Raven does not approve of the barriers that Professor has put in Jean's mind. And like Wolverine in X3, sees this as non-consensual. The next sequence, when Professor X is again in Jean's head without her consent, he says, Jean, don't be afraid, it's only me. So these three are the Cerebro, and Jean is like all freaked out because she's got this new like powerful force inside of her, and she's lying in her bed like, what's going on with me? And then of course he's speaking in her head, and she freaks out and starts panicking. She tells him, get out of my head. And we kind of go back to the moment with Cerebro, and Professor says to Hank and Mystique or Raven, she's fighting me, I need to turn it up. So he's referring to turning up the power of Cerebro so that he can get into her brain and be in there with her. So the whole scene is beyond icky, and really, in my opinion, reads like an assault. It's crucial to note that in the comic version of this storyline, Professor Xavier does not install walls in Jean's mind. In the comic version, the professor has a psychic battle with Phoenix. So the cosmic force kind of is functioning differently in this moment in the comics. And together, Jean Grey and Professor Xavier seal off Phoenix in Jean's mind. So as Prater concludes, quote, the problematic narrative in the films whereby the patriarchal expert seals a woman off from her power for her own good without caring about her consent is not a narrative supported by the X-Men comics. Indeed, Professor Xavier would not be able to seal off Jean's powers without her help, and she gives such help as an adult with full knowledge of the consequences of her actions. So one of the arguments that sometimes gets made for really regressive narratives, especially in superhero films, is that they draw their inspiration from earlier comics, which were, started to be written in the 60s and 70s. So there's this argument that gets made where, oh, well, gender politics were so regressive back then. And so of course the films are regressive because that's where they get their material from, right? And as Prater demonstrates, there's really no evidence to support that. I mean, there is some evidence, but not when you look directly at these two storylines that I'm talking about. So the X-Men franchise punishes female characters in really spectacular ways. Rogue is one of the most powerful mutants when her character exists in many of the comic books, but in the films, she's always portrayed as this young, insecure girl. Jean Grey is this demure, obedient woman until she gets taken over by Phoenix. And then, of course, like all supervillains who are female, becomes incredibly powerful and sexy. In Dark Phoenix, Jean's emotions are what cause her to lose control and unleash her powers on those around her. It reads a lot like a trauma narrative in which past traumatic events bubble up when she's triggered by something in her environment and she's unable to control them. So it's almost like a flashback kind of a thing, although we're not flashing back to anything. Like I said before, it's significant that in the comic books, Jean's transformation into Phoenix, or when the cosmic force enters her, is positive. In the comics, she turns evil because of bad guys, the Hellfire Club, and it's not because of her own inability to control her powers the way it is in the film. In addition, in the comic books, there are these parallel narratives amongst, between some of the most strong empaths, notably Jean Grey and Professor Xavier, which emphasize the dangers of being a psychic. So there's some kind of like parity between these storylines. So it's not just Jean Grey or the female superhero who's like out of control and can't control her powers. So the film version works to show Jean as this young, distressed woman who cannot control her power, and these weaknesses seem to come from within her. So there's many sequences in Dark Phoenix where Jean says something like, I can't control it. I don't know what's happening to me. And the it remains ambiguous, although obviously we're meant to think that it's the Phoenix or cosmic power inside of her that she's talking about. The Dark Phoenix causes Jean to have vast powers that she can't control, and her rage and pain, because she's an empath, literally destabilize the world around her. And this happens in several places. I'm just going to take you through a couple of them. So early in the film, at the X-Men celebration party after they save the NASA people, she seems to have some kind of it looks like a weird flashback, and she grabs her head and starts going, stop, stop. And then she sort of looses this force on the party, and then she goes and passes out. So she gets kind of like this uncontrollable emotional response, and then her emotions kind of like knock out people around her. In another sequence, Jean Grey has returned to her father's house, and she's just learned that her birth father is alive, but gave her up to Professor Xavier. Jean's emotions take over, and items in the house begin to float and move. And so typically when this happens, you can kind of see, this is outside of her father's house, there's like bits of wood and things. So she just kind of like picks things up with her mind and starts throwing them around. And in this particular sequence, the X-Men show up to retrieve her. And there's a big battle where they're sort of trying to convince Jean to like calm down and stop being so crazy and powerful and angry. And this just, of course, makes her angrier. And so she's lashing out. There's like objects flying all over the place. And it's in this sequence that she accidentally kills Mystique. I should have said spoiler alert, but I didn't. So now it's spoiled. So Jean Grey's rage and trauma is pretty understandable, considering that her mom died in a car crash because of her powers when she was 8. Her dad gave her up because he was scared of her and because he blames her for her mother's death. Professor Xavier, who's supposed to be like her savior, forces himself into her mind. And then later on in this film, Eric or Magneto tries to kill her when she turns to him for help. So, you know, the rage, in my opinion, is pretty understandable. And the deep misogyny of the storyline is very typical, as I've said, of the X-Men film franchise that excels at spectacularly punishing and killing the strongest female superheroes. I haven't seen I think I've seen all the X-Men films. I haven't seen all the kind of like larger Marvel Universe films, but I can think of at least 2 moments where both Jean Grey and Raven or Mystique are killed or like really rendered impotent in 2 different films in the sequence. So as Prater argues, quote, when the women in the films lose their powers, it's because of something inherent to their powers rather than villains who exploit their weaknesses. Indeed, whereas Jean Grey cannot retain control over her powerful psychic abilities, the male character's loss of control is always due to an attack from an outside force, end quote. But I want to push this reading a little bit more, and I want to read these sort of moments that I've laid out for you through this perspective of a trauma empath narrative. What I'm interested in here is the ways in which the Jean Grey characters lines up with what I see as the shifting discourse around being an empath. Jean can't control her emotions and unleashes her feelings into the world, inflicting them literally on those around her. The Jean Grey character in some way behaves in ways that line up with how white women are empowered to put their emotions on display and take up space with them. 2 easy examples might be through the trope of angry Karens, which I feel like TikTok is full of this if your algorithm is terrible and shows that stuff. And also this kind of white women crying about other people's trauma. In these cases, the privilege of white femininity is taking up space with emotions that recenter whiteness and displace the experiences of racialized and Indigenous people. And I have one, I think this is my final spoof for you. It's brilliantly spoofed in this article in the Hard Times. So obviously this is a spoof. As an empath, racism affects me more. So I'm going to read you a little bit of this. A lot of people look at me and see a stay-at-home mama with 2 beautiful, healthy babies, a home, a hubby, and yes, flawless white skin. What they don't see is the burden of the oppressed and marginalized African-American experience that has been energetically passed on to me. But I bear that weight on my pasty shoulders, for it is the curse of being an empath. Racism actually affects me more. As you can imagine, the key to keeping my sanity has been learning to develop healthy boundaries. Even though they don't mean to, many people of color don't realize the discomfort they're putting me through when they share stories like being passed over for jobs they were more qualified to get. It's not their fault, but unloading all that hurt onto me drains me of my positive life force. Unless you're an empath, you can't know how this feels. Again, it's kind of a brilliant parody that really centers sort of the ways in which white women, like their feelings recenter their experiences and kind of marginalize the experiences, particularly of, in this case, racialized people. In her article, White Women's Empathy and the Brown Lives They Decenter, Tina Nagata looks at an incident in which a Maori woman in New Zealand is speaking about racism in the justice system in a television news broadcast. And the anchor, who's sort of like interviewing her for the story, she's this white woman and she starts to cry. So Nagata looks at the ways that this woman's tears are so remarked upon across subsequent news cycles, to the point that this white woman's tears becomes the story and ends up completely sidelining the systemic racism that the original story was about. I'm going to read quite a lengthy quote from Nagata. She says, quote, "What we see when we see white women's tears are all of the tears that we are not allowed. It reminds us of our sisters who have been numbed into tearlessness, watching their men get locked away and their children taken from their arms, but then further punished for showing unacceptable emotion when they face their state oppressors. In white women's tears, we see the all-powerful call to arms that has rallied their colonial male counterparts to launch to their defense and attack brown women for usually just speaking the truth. We see the unassailable weapon that has been used since time immemorial to silence brown truth and shut down important discussions about injustice against brown people. We see a tool commonly used in the justice system to get white people acquitted and get brown people convicted. We see a tactic that is rolled out every day around the world to avoid accountability for ignorant racism. We see the spotlight stealer, the center of attention, the constant reminder that it takes a white woman caring about us to make our news worthy. The great white marginalizer," end quote. Obviously in Dark Phoenix, there's no obvious narrative or sort of like another character who Jean's emotions are sidelining or decentering. Her emotions are at the center, and that's the point. On the one hand, she's constantly punished and controlled by the men in her life, and on the other hand, she has the freedom to constantly have these big, messy emotions. I want to wrap up by returning to the work of Rebecca Wanzo and her work on Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower trilogy. So for people who might be not familiar with it, this image is actually one of the many cover images that was published on the front cover of one of the books in the trilogy. And Parable of the Sower kind of regained popularity recently. It was originally written, like, I want to say in the 90s. I should have looked that up before I spoke. And the setting is this post-apocalyptic America. It's incredibly violent. Infrastructure's crumbled. People are like homeless. And it centers on this young Black woman who people are sort of like almost traveling like refugees through California on all the highways. And she ends up banding together with a group of people, keeping them safe in this like violent post-apocalyptic world and starting this new peaceful community and religion. And during Donald Trump's presidency, people were really excited and terrified to go back and reread these novels because they seemed so incredibly prescient, given that they were written decades before he was elected. So Rebecca Wanzo, this is a little outside of her project on sympathy and empathy. And in this essay on the Parable of the Sower, she talks about how she sees Octavia Butler engaging with empathy in these books. So what she thinks is that, well, she does locate them in the tradition of sentimental literature that I discussed earlier, but she argues that the Parable of the Sower trilogy is very atypical of the trope. Rather than suggesting that empathy can make political progress, Parable of the Sower shows Lauren, the protagonist, distancing herself from her feelings. And so the protagonist, Lauren Olamina, her name is, has this syndrome called hyper-empathy syndrome that she got because her mom did these drugs and passed on this weird syndrome to her child, who's Lauren. And so hyper-empathy syndrome means that Lauren can really feel anybody else's pain to the extent that it's incredibly debilitating. And you can imagine that in a violent post-apocalyptic world that it's a big problem. So what Wanzo argues is that, quote, in her radical intervention, Octavia Butler decenters feelings and the individual and focuses on community politics. While Lauren suffers from hyperempathy, it becomes necessary for her to distance herself from feeling in order to survive and get political work done. Empathy contributes to the conditions that make Lauren a political visionary, but her political manifesto never claims that mere feeling will produce liberation for anyone, end quote. So what's really interesting here is Wanzo's looks at how Octavia Butler makes this move where Lauren, having hyperempathy syndrome, essentially being an empath, gives her this insight that allows her to be this incredible leader and to think about how an equitable community might function, but she actually has to distance herself from her empathy in order to kind of be effective in the world. So I offer Lauren's character in Parable of the Sower as an alternative iteration of how empathy might work as a superpower. I offer Parable of the Sower as an antidote to the limits of the imagination that show up in superhero films, where producers deliberately choose the most offensive aspects of the superhero narrative to take from the comic book to the big screen. And I should say here that I was really inspired by Erin Morton's talk on Taylor Swift and her white settler femininity. And I see white emotions and this recent trend towards empathy as an identity marker as being really connected to the construction of white settler femininity, whereby white women feel entitled to express whatever emotion they feel. And as Catherine Hales has noted in a completely different text, science fiction and science are not culturally separate spheres. These are spheres that are overlapping and mutually influencing. So I think if we take that and apply them to the superhero genre, we can see the same thing. So we can see that we have this empath, this kind of like superpower of empathy that exists in the world of science fiction and the world of superhero films, comic books, and just sort of like all the various media. And the way that this term empath has been taken up by psychology and other sort of like medical discourses. And so these, again, are not separate spheres, but they are mutually influencing spheres. And when I was doing a really terrible job at academic research and just kind of asking my Facebook friends in a public Facebook post, like where they thought, where or when they thought this science fiction empath had entered mainstream discourse, someone said, oh, I think it's when the people our age started becoming therapists, right? So again, it's sort of that way that the, culture is complex, and science and science fiction, or medicine and fiction, are always kind of influencing each other. And I think it's important to be attentive to these things. So when looking at this, what I'm thinking of is sort of like this new-ish empathy moment. We need to be attentive to the erasures and the way that older texts, including superhero films, recenter whiteness and the logistics of settler colonialism. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sabine.